Welcome to the second episode of God and Man. I'm your host, Sam, and on today's episode, we're going to be looking at identity. Now, I think in today's culture, individualism is where people find their identity, that they find who they are in themselves. They make up for themselves their own identity. But is this true? I don't think it is. Well, not entirely, right? See, people will make up for themselves an identity from their own cultural experiences, and there's influences from outside on that. You can't do that in a bubble, but yet there's somewhat individual nature to it. But people love to conform to a group. They love to be part of a group, and this is where social media has allowed individualism to be rampant, because you can have a very, very, very niche identity which would not be affirmed by anyone around you. But because of the internet and social media, you can find your very, very, very niche group that does affirm that identity, and it becomes true. Otherwise, it just wouldn't exist, right? Communities and groups in which these identities sprout up would be pushed down. And this is why there's an aspect of individualism that is possibly good, right? In that it allows for some sort of self-expression, that we are different individuals. But culture has gone too far in that you can be whoever you want to be despite the group that you're a part of. But it's not true to say that individualism is the only thing that governs people. See, they must need a group to affirm who they are. And so when we think of identity and who we are and what our identity is, yes, there's parts of us that are our identity. It's individual. But if it wasn't for a group that affirms it, we wouldn't believe it. And now that can have many connotations in today's society with gender theory and a bunch of other stuff. But in today's episode, I want to think about two major groups, particularly Jordan Peterson talks about it a little bit, but the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressed and the oppressor. And I think they're two major groups that we can see in society. So the oppressed, they would be the people who would see as the minorities, the ones who are under the power of rulers, governors, people, even in small groups, the dynamic of a husband and a wife, like we could see the woman, not as strong as the man, would be in a relationship where she is the oppressed one. Now, it doesn't mean that he is literally oppressing them. What the groups mean is that there's someone with superiority, authority, or a power over another group. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that someone is literally being oppressed. And so people in the oppressed group can be seen as the people who are the minorities under the power, authorities, or rules of others. Now, the issue with this thinking is that in any group where people are oppressed, there's always going to be a hierarchy level where someone is the oppressor, someone with some level of authority or control. It happens in any group, naturally. I remember doing some small group training, leaders of small groups, and there's a thinking that you can do no leader groups, where it's all just led communally together, but those groups always have a de facto leader. Like if you were to ask them, who organizes things, who makes things happen, they would identify the same person if you ask them all, right? And so in groups when there's no specified leader, there is, it's not spoken of. And so yes, in the oppressed group, what you see is this issue of, well, there's always going to be a hierarchy where someone has authority over someone else, which is the one thing they want to fight against. And so the oppressed group is a very odd group to be a part of. Now, the other group, the oppressor, the one with the power, authority, control, it's usually the majority group. But again, it falls into the same issue of the oppressed group, is there's always a hierarchy. Is that if you would identify yourself as a group that has the power, the authority, and the control, well, someone's going to lead that group. There's always going to be a leader of the group, someone who has the superiority, the authority. And so as men in today's culture and society, what are particular groups out of these that we can find ourselves tempted to identify with, right? What can we see ourselves attaching ourselves to? And some of them might not be that bad. Some of them might be fine. So for instance, like the idea of being alpha. for a man is a big one, and it's seen, and it comes from, and it developed, as an idea of toxic masculinity these days, that being alpha, being strong or something is toxic. That's not true. That's just ridiculous. Men have always been strong and powerful, but it's what you do with that power, right? So being identifying and having a sense of strength or power, being alpha as a man, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what you do with that power. And so, in a sense, sometimes we can see our own identity in our strength, in our power, in our authority over others. And sometimes that can be good. Sometimes that can be used to actually oppress people genuinely. So that's one particular group. In today's culture, there'd be people advocating for this on different levels. I think Jordan Peterson has a very helpful reflection on what it looks like to have power and authority as a man, but yet not wield it over others. He talks about the capacity for violence, he says, that men who have the capacity to do it but withhold are usually men with good moral standing, that they could, if they had to, employ violence, but they don't want to. They don't seek it first. I should try and find a good video of that and talk about it on another episode. But genuinely, he provides some great reflections on that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, thinking about the oppressed group, thinking about what kind of identities we can find ourselves in here, I think we need to be careful because this particular group is broad and vast, and in our culture can be quite destroying. So if you think about current gender ideology and all of that, it would say it's the oppressed group. But in our current culture, is it? Is it really? They pretend to be the oppressed group, but are they? They seem to have all these rights and powers that they can do whatever they want. You can have men walking into women's bathrooms. You can have people wearing absolutely nothing walking down the street and just saying, this is my identity. I can be who I want to be and you can't do anything to stop me. And it's like, is that really oppressed? Are you really oppressed? Where I'm living at the moment, it has some very, very woke people. And are they oppressed? No, they're not. They're not oppressed. But they would identify in this group, which is quite intriguing. But then there's other groups as well. Current Israel-Palestine stuff that's been going on. People would say that Palestine is the oppressed, Israel is the oppressor, and there's definitely truth in that dynamic. But the issue is they attach morality to being in one group or the other. That the person who is oppressed is the morally upright, whereas the oppressor is morally degenerate, which isn't true. These groups don't have morality attached to them. You can be under the authority of another and be morally corrupt. You can have authority over someone and be morally good, and vice versa, right? And so self-identifying with a group because they're oppressed isn't necessarily the right way to go. Particularly if you're a Christian, you can find yourself tempted to identify with the oppressed group, right? Because they seem to be the downtrodden. But we need to be careful. You need to ask yourself, are they actually downtrodden? Are they actually the oppressed? Because if they're not, all you're doing is self-identifying with the morally corrupt. So this does beg the question then, what is a Christian identity? What is a Christian identity? Do we identify with the oppressed? Should we identify and be part of communities of the oppressed? Or are we the oppressor? Throughout history, people would argue that Christianity is the oppressor, that it has always been the oppressor. So which is it? Well, I think Jesus is actually both. Jesus is both the oppressor and the oppressed. So I want to take us to Colossians chapter 1. And this is what it says. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. See, Jesus here, he is supreme. He's the head of the church, the body. In him all things hold together. And just before this, it says he created all things as well. Jesus is the ultimate oppressor. There is no one with more superiority, authority, and control than Jesus. He rules over everything. And so, as Christians, one should identify as an oppressor. That's what a Christian identity is. We are the oppressor. We are the ones who have the king who rules over everything. who has supremacy over everything, right? But we're also the oppressed. We're also the oppressed. So I want to take us Philippians 2. This is what's said about Jesus by Paul, who, being in very nature God, that is Jesus, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, right? God himself. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So as Christians, we're oppressors, but we're also oppressed. See, Jesus, he himself was God, supreme over all things, but he humbled himself. He became a servant. In the Greek, that word means slave. If we think of all the people who are genuinely suppressed, oppressed, it's those who are slaves, right? And this is what Jesus did. And to the point where God dies on a cross. Jesus is both the ultimate oppressor and the oppressed. And that is who Jesus is. He's the ultimate king, ruler, supreme over everything. But he's also the one who humbled himself, became a slave, and humbled himself to the point of becoming obedient to death. So what is the Christian identity? Well, the Christian identity is found in the man who is God himself, supreme over all things, yet humbled himself and became a slave to all and became obedient to even die. To even die. But what about us as Christians? As Christians, what can we identify as? Well, we too are slaves. So Paul, when he writes this in 2 Corinthians, for what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Again, servants can mean slave there. Paul is saying he is slaves to the church as he preaches Jesus as king. And it's interesting duality there that while being a slave, he also identifies and preaches the oppressor, the king, the ruler. And so this is significant. We need to remember that being the oppressor, it isn't a moral identification. You're not identifying something as being morally corrupt by saying it's the oppressor. It's just saying that they have superiority, authority, and control over someone else. And so for us, if we desire to be that, there's one more great passage really talks about this, and that's Mark 9. Looking at verse 33. So this is just off the back of Jesus' transfiguration. They've seen the disciples have seen his glory, and they're starting to think, oh, Jesus is going to bring about the kingdom. I want to be his right-hand man. And they start arguing about that on the way, right? And then verse 33, they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what are you arguing about on the road? But they kept quiet because on the way, he'd argued about who was the greatest. That's what they were arguing about. So sitting down, Jesus called the 12, and this is what he said to them. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant or slave of all. See, this is the duality of the Christian life. As Jesus, as the one with authority over all things, he's supreme over all things. He's also the one who humbled himself and became a slave to all and made himself obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Christians follow the exact same example. If we want to be the greatest, if we want to be someone with leadership, control, and power over others, we need to be a slave to others, a servant of all. We don't oppress all, we serve all. And so this is what Christian identity is. When we think about oppressor and the oppressed, for the Christian, it's a life of duality. We are both aligned and preaching the lordship of Christ, that he is supreme over everything. And because we do that, people will call us oppressors. But we are also to be a slave of all, to be humble, to be meek. And so we ourselves will also be oppressed. If you look at early church and a lot of the early church history, and the church not in the West, oppression of Christians is very real. They die regularly for what they believe. But a lot of in the West, it's not death, but shame. In the West, we're shamed for what we believe. And so in Christian identity means preaching Jesus as Lord and being a slave of all. And no matter how much we're tempted to align ourselves with one group or the other, we always need to hold that tension together. Because Jesus was both. He was the oppressor and the oppressed. But interestingly, he wasn't always the oppressed. See, he was God as man, humbled himself to death, then was raised to life, and returned to the world to judge. He wasn't always the oppressed, but he eternally will be the ruler. And so when we think about what groups we identify with, or what groups we might ideologically align ourselves with, we need to be careful, because the only one that really genuinely matters is Jesus. And do we align and find our identity in him and not in these other groups, not being strong, alpha, in control, in leadership, and not the oppressed group. And remembering that there's no moral identity tied to being part of either. You're not morally upright for being oppressed. You can't continually keep calling yourself the oppressed group to make yourself morally upright. It doesn't work like that. Jesus was oppressed by the morally corrupt, yes. But he's also the one who has superiority and authority and control over all things as the oppressor, right? But he was not morally corrupt. He was found without sin at his trial. Jesus was perfectly sinless, yet he has control over all things. So both groups don't have to necessarily come with some sort of moral identity, yet our world puts one on them. They say if you have superiority and control over others, then you are morally corrupt. There needs to be an even line between all people. It's basically New Age Marxism, really, which is totally anti-Christian, by the way. If you don't think it is, then you need to read up on Marxist theology and what he thought about Christians. He absolutely hated Christians. He hated Christianity. Having hierarchy and people in control is normal. It's good. And then when it comes to the oppressed groups that we might find ourselves wanting to identify with, we need to be careful. Like I said earlier, we need to be careful. They're not always oppressed, genuinely oppressed. Sometimes they are, and as Christians, we want to be getting alongside them and to love them and to serve them. But if people just claim to be oppressed and really they're not, well, then we're going to find ourselves identifying with people who, at minimum, are unaware of their privileged position of authority over others. Or, at worst, we're aligning ourselves with people who are quite morally corrupt. And so in all of this, our identity, our Christian identity, is found in Jesus, who is both the oppressor and the oppressed. The one who has authority over all things, yet humbled himself, became a slave of all, and became obedient to death. So thank you for listening to the second episode of God and Man. And on the third episode, we're going to be looking at some popular voices in culture that talk about a whole lot of these things and others. So people like Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, Andrew Tate, other people like that. I'm very keen to have a look at some of the stuff that they talk about in that episode and see what it says about men in particular, how we engage with these ideas that they talk about a lot, and particularly coming from a Christian perspective on those things. But anyway, thank you again for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode of God and Man.